Now, have you ever wondered how someone can take a real event, like something tragic that you might have heard about in the news, and turn it into a TV series? For Robert Cooper, the best way to go about it is to make it as true to reality as you can. And Robert is the showrunner behind Unspeakable, which is a new miniseries on CBC that takes you inside the tainted blood scandal that shook Canada back in the 1980s. Thousands of Canadians were infected with HIV and hepatitis C after the Canadian Red Cross was slow to start screening donated blood at that time. People died. There was a criminal investigation and a huge federal inquiry. And what some consider to be the worst part of all this is that it all could have been prevented. And that is something that Robert Cooper says he will never forget. He was actually one of the thousands of people infected with hepatitis C. And Robert was just a kid when it happened. And as you're about to hear, it's something that had a huge impact on his life. He took that experience and he made it the focus of his latest television project, Unspeakable, which premieres next week. But before I got into the making of the show with Robert, he shared his own story.
I was born with hemophilia, which is a genetic disorder. It means your blood doesn't clot quite as well as normal people, and you need to take blood products when you're having a bleeding issue. And then around the early 80s was when HIV/AIDS became more of a threat to the blood system, and it was around that time that a revolutionary new blood product was emerging, and it was a concentrate that was pooled from as many as 20,000 blood donors. It was a tragic part of the story because that product was going to change hemophiliacs' lives, and really that sort of revolutionary step forward ended up being, what killed so many people.
Mm-hmm. I remember my father was on blood thinners for a number of different things he was suffering from. So when he would bleed, it would be for a long time. And as children, we were scared to see that. I can't imagine in your condition as a hemophiliac, how did your parents talk to you about all this? This is something you had since day one, right?
My parents were always incredibly forthright and honest and did an incredible job of trying to help me lead a normal life. I mean, I would say even at the height of the AIDS and hepatitis scare, I was maybe, I wouldn't say blissfully oblivious, but I was certainly not as probably worried as they were.
What point was it that you decided that you wanted to make a series about the tainted blood scandal?
It was 2014, if you could call that recent. I dealt with hepatitis C most of my life and actually got quite ill around 2013, 2014. When my condition sort of started to decline, it just so happened there were some new combination therapies which are now actually being employed today very successfully coming on the market. And I was able to finally clear the virus. So I'm very lucky to be virus-free at this point. And I think it was really around that time that I got that good news that I stopped thinking about myself so much as a victim. I think when you're going through something like that, I mean, one of the tools you employ is denial. You almost you do what you have to do for your own health and for your family, but you also don't necessarily always want to engage so much in what's happening to you outside of that. And so I think when I got the good news, my mindset changed a little bit more from being a victim to being a storyteller, which is, one of the other sort of things that I am. I certainly, at that point, was kind of galvanized to try and tell a story.
Mm-hmm. Now, just getting into the story a little bit, Unspeakable tells the story of the tainted blood scandal from the perspective of two families. Both families have children who are hemophiliacs, who are then, obviously at risk of contracting HIV or Hep C. And your show does not shy away from how precisely distressing this is for all parts of the family, or the family as a whole. Why did you want to show that side of the story?
Well, it's real. I mean, our goal from the start was to try and be as close to the truth as possible. And as much as that, I think, is difficult at times, certainly I think that the people who were directly involved and who worked with me on the show and contributed it's been hard for all of us, and I think we all felt a responsibility to people who aren't around to tell their story, to kind of be as honest and truthful and accurate to the reality as we could. And I think, I was asked early on, like, how is the show different from other dramas that explored the AIDS crisis or prejudice during that era? And I mean, what's interesting to me and unique about the show is that it's not just about the emergence or the contraction. It's not about the moment of the crisis. It starts then. It starts in 1982, but the show fast forwards through time as you go. It's 8 hours, and by the end of it, you're in 2015. We really wanted to look at the effect of a tragedy on a lifetime. As much as it is about the AIDS crisis and what happened during the Tainted blood scandal, it was an opportunity to look at how tragedy affects a lifetime, and how loss and grief don't disappear, and how it can affect the choices you make and how you ultimately lead your life.
You said your family was fairly honest and straightforward about things. So did you draw from your own family for a lot of these stories, or did you go outside of your own experiences mostly?
I would say it was a split. There's definitely scenes in the show that are ripped right out of my own personal experience, and I think that adds to a certain amount of authenticity. You always want to put a piece of yourself into what you're doing. It makes it feel more real and truthful, and hopefully resonates with people that way. But at the same time, this is a story that affected so many, and as I said, so many in ways that were far more profound even than what I went through. And so it was very important to us. The show is a drama. The characters are fictionalized. A lot of them, some of them are real folks. But what we did was create composites. We took sort of the best or worst aspects of the story and really tried to cover as much as we possibly could.
If you're just tuning in, I'm Ali Hassan in for Tom Power, and you're listening to Q. Robert Cooper is my guest, and he's the showrunner of the new miniseries Unspeakable about Canada's tainted blood scandal, and it premieres on CBC on January 9th. I want to give people a little feel for the show here. The characters in Unspeakable deal with a lot of negative stigma around having hemophilia. So let's play a clip here.
Ryan came home pretty upset the other day after Carson said they can't be friends anymore.
My sister lives in Florida. Haemophiliacs down there are getting AIDS from the blood they take. Ryan shouldn't be playing with the other kids.
Even if Ryan had AIDS, you can't get it from casual contact, but he doesn't have it.
Do you have proof? People are dying, not just gay people. It can be spread through saliva and blood. Kids share food. Boys get rough sometimes.
Ryan's pretty responsible.
You've got some nerve. Only thinking of your kids' feelings, not taking my son's life, other people into account.
That's a clip from the new miniseries Unspeakable. Robert, this is a very emotional scene. Can you unpack what we just heard there?
I mean, that was that sort of thing was not uncommon. I mean, I wear a bracelet, a medical alert bracelet that tells people that I have hemophilia, and it was you didn't want to wear it. You didn't want people to know. I mean, one of the reasons the show is called Unspeakable, and frankly, one of the reasons that the tragedy happened was because people were afraid to speak out. I mean, there's a scene in the show where they're at an Ontario Hemophilia Society meeting, and one guy sort of puts up his hand and says he doesn't want the newsletter to be sent to his house because the mail would reveal that he had hemophilia. Hemophiliacs were included in what was called the 4-H Club, which were the high-risk groups of homosexuals, heroin users, Haitians, and hemophiliacs. And so there was this stigma about the disease. And, I had a kid tell me I can't hang out with you anymore because my parents said you could give me AIDS. And, I mean, there's a point now where I look back on that and there's an objective part of me that has to say, look, we know so much more now than we did then, and it was terrifying, and I can put myself in the place of that other mother, but it also doesn't make you feel very good when you're the one who is dealing with that stigma.
Mm-hmm. I talk to a lot of people who work on things that are very close to them, as this story is to you. Some people will find it therapeutic. Others find it very difficult and grueling. You've alluded to a little bit of both. What was it like for you to revisit these memories?
I wouldn't say it's an easy thing to do. You almost have to take I listened to Judge Horace Creever, who ran the inquiry, talk a lot about how he had to remain unbiased in his view. People sort of often actually felt he came off uncaring, but it was important for him to be perceived as looking at things in an objective way. And I think as a writer of something like this, in order for it not to feel like you're too strongly taking one side, you also have to kind of take an almost clinical approach to looking at the evidence in the situation. Having said that, you can't help it, and frankly, for me, it was easily the most rewarding experience I've ever had professionally, because at the moment you open yourself up, and the moment you sort of expose yourself the way I ultimately did, people open themselves up to you, and the stories I heard, and the emotion, and frankly the gratitude for telling the story. But also the way in which people interacted with me was so different from any other experience I've ever had.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
Sure. I mean, I was being interviewed by a television station. We were doing some shooting in a hospital in Comox, and there they are talking to me. And when the camera stopped, the woman who was interviewing me said, I have a story to tell you. And she basically told me all about her experience, and someone very close to her had died as a result of tainted blood, and it was a very emotional story for her to tell me. I don't think, obviously that's not something I would have heard any other way, but also there's a connection that happens between people when you're sharing these kinds of intimate personal stories that makes you feel closer as human beings. It makes you feel like you have a shared experience that, even though those events are tragic and incredibly painful, that the ability to kind of come together and share those experiences gives you a little bit more of a feeling like you're not alone.
I have one final question for you, Robert. If this series, had been created 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, how do you think it would have helped you or other people with hemophilia and related conditions?
The folks that I've been talking to and that I know in the community are very grateful that the show's being made now. I think that we are, and one of the things I discovered as I kind of dove into this is that so many people really don't know anything about it. I mean, you talk to people on the street and maybe they're vaguely aware, but certainly my kids, who are, teenagers and going on, into their 20s, their friends had no idea, like absolutely no idea. And that's pretty surprising to me. That's such a major event in our history. And it's not that long ago, just was starting to fade, and I think it's hopefully a good time to remind people that that we have to be incredibly vigilant in our oversight and our actions in protecting ourselves, not just in terms of our health and safety, but in every respect.
That is Robert Cooper, the showrunner behind Unspeakable, a very, very strong series that I was able to preview. And it premieres next week on Wednesday, January 19th. Oh, no, January 9th on CBC.